You're listening to Mobility in Motion, a podcast produced by Dallas Area Rapid Transit. I'm your host, Nadine Lee, President and CEO of DART. Nancy Hopkins was 19 when she heard a lecture by Nobel Prize winner James Watson, the co-author of a paper suggesting the double helix structure of DNA. It was the early 1960s, and she was inspired to start a career in science. By the late 1990s, she was a geneticist and tenured professor at MIT. Despite her success, she was seeing a difference in the way she and other female colleagues were being treated. Her lab space was smaller. She was cut out of opportunities. Discrimination can be vague and subtle, so she took her science skills and started measuring her space versus the space of men who had lower ranks. She gathered evidence and, with 15 other female colleagues who had similar experiences, made an appointment with the dean to present their case. Their work triggered a national dialogue around sexism in science. A quarter of a century later, this story still feels familiar to me. Right now, I'm an executive of a major public transportation system, but my education and early career was as a civil engineer. I've always seen myself as a scientist first, and it's through this lens that I connected with this episode's story. In 2023, I heard an interview with Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Kate Zernike, who documented Nancy Hopkins' story in her book, The Exceptions, Nancy Hopkins, MIT, and the Fight for Women in Science. In her book, Kate Zernike writes about how women are often marginalized in the workplace and sometimes unconsciously pushed to the sidelines by their male coworkers. I got a chance to speak with Kate Zernike at a recent conference. Kate, I'm so happy to have you here.
I'm so glad to be here. Thank you, Nadine.
So let's talk a little bit about Nancy Hopkins. Let's talk first about marginalization generally.
I think that is the word that resonated with a lot of people. And I'll say, by the time I had finished reporting for the book, I knew exactly what the title was going to be. I knew it was The Exceptions because that word kept coming up, exceptions, exceptional. But I didn't have a subtitle. And I like to joke that the subtitle should be The Exceptions, a Universal Story, because it really isn't just women in science. There's a scene in the book, a very pivotal scene that was the lead of the story when I first wrote about Nancy Hopkins in the Boston Globe in 1999. And it's Nancy, who's a tenured professor of biology at MIT, and she's taking her tape measure around the labs, and she measures and she figures out that she has less lab space, less office space than even men of less stature than she is. And I think for a lot of people, the tape measure really resonated. Like the tape measure is now in the MIT Museum because it gave people a way to talk about something, as you say, that we've all been feeling, right? And so marginalization was a really new concept to me when I first heard about this. I was a young reporter at the time. I was 30 years old. And it really was this sort of this gradual thing that's happening, right? Like many of the things that happened to Nancy Hopkins in this book are not things where most of us would raise our hand and say, hey, I'm being discriminated against. But it's this pattern. It's this, subtle, like you're just kind of shoved aside a little bit. And then suddenly you find yourself way, completely off the field, essentially. So I think marginalization is really, it can come down to really small things like the email that you're not included on or the project that you're not included on. Or somebody thinks, they develop a project and it's developed over a dinner and, they didn't invite you. Oh, well, because you're not in the usual group, right? So it's these small slights that add up over time. But I think it's really it's a very profound concept because so many of us do find ourselves, especially sort of mid and late career, well, wait a minute, how did I end up here? And there's this feeling of oh my God, I was put out to pasture and how did I not raise my hand?
Or how did I not notice, right?
Exactly.
And not just seeing it, because the other piece in the book that I find very interesting is that it's not that Nancy didn't see things.
Yeah.
She just actually thought maybe it's just me.
Right. Maybe I'm the exception. Exactly.
Yeah. Maybe I'm the exception, or maybe, she could see it happening in other people. She just didn't think it was happening to her.
What this story really taught me was that it's not just about opening the door for women or for any marginalized group, right? It's how you treat people once they get in the door. But, when you talk about kind of understanding and seeing how this happens to Nancy, slight by slight by slight, that was kind of the trick, the challenge, and the opportunity of the book. At the time, the women talked about marginalization, but they also described as unconscious bias, right? Which is Now we're so familiar with that term. At the time, it was a new term. The first big academic paper on unconscious bias was in 1995. So when these women talked about it in 1999, it was like, oh, wow, that's a revelation to me. But then I come back to write this book 20 years later, and it's like, how am I going to get this across to people when many people think unconscious bias is either non-existent or we've cured it, or, oh, that's just wokeism, right? Like, don't talk to me about that. But so I think it's really important that it was very important to me to tell the story of how this marginalization happens and how it affects Nancy's personal life, her professional life, how it affects her view of herself, and how it does really make her, it turns her into an activist, which is kind of remarkable. But again, so trying to sort of get across to people how this happens on a day-to-day level. And I do think it resonates with women. I have a lot of women who say, thank you for this. It was so painful. And I always feel like I just said, I'm so sorry, but thanks a lot. I'm glad you liked the book.
Well, I think, maybe painful to relive experiences through the eyes of Nancy Hopkins. I know I've had conversations with some of my female executives, and they really, for a long time, refused to believe that some of these things were happening.
Yeah. One of the questions I get most from women as I've spoken about the book in the last year since it came out is, what's the right response in that moment, right? Like, do I respond to this person? Do I shut them down? Or is that too confrontational and they'll become alienated? Do I talk to them afterwards? So I do think it's really tricky. But when you talk about this, some of the women literally described, it was like they said they had blinders on because they were so afraid that if they paid attention to this or that, they would get thrown off track. There are so many of the critical moments in this book are those moments of connection, right? There were 15 women with tenure at MIT in 1994 when these women started, and 197 men. Because there were so few of them, they were all working in different buildings. There weren't women in their departments. There were women in the departments, but there weren't women in their buildings who they could talk to and compare notes with. When they do finally start to compare notes, it's like, oh my God, someone else feels the way I do. And it's so empowering. And so there's this one moment where Nancy, she first has a conversation with one woman who's about, I think, 15 years older than she is. And that woman says, yes, I've seen this too. And then Nancy says, do you think there might be others? And it's like the whole world opens up to them, and suddenly they have a path forward.
Part of this is connecting the dots for women of today faster than it happened for Nancy, right?
Yes.
And so I want to get to that at some point in this discussion. But I want to go back to this idea of the meritocracy too, because we do all very genuinely want to believe that we can get by on our own merits.
Yeah.
And that's really just not the case.
We all have this idea that meritocracy is like gravity, right? Like there's an equation and we can figure it out. The reality is, merit is conferred, right? Like people are making those judgments. They're human beings. And so the easiest thing to do is what we all do. We kind of revert to what everyone's done in the past. One thing that Nancy was very worried about when I started doing this book was she was very worried. She wanted me to she was like, do you have to use real names when I was talking about the men and the various things that happened to her? And I was like, well, yeah, I'm a journalist. I do, use real names. But I promised her I'm going to talk to all of these men, anyone who will talk to me. And I'm going to get their side of the story, and I'm going to tell people their side of the story. And in the end, the compliment that she paid me that I really appreciated was that, it sounds kind of funny, but she said, I never understood my own life until I read your book. Meaning, she was really wondering, why did these men treat her this way? She really, even to this day, was like, was it something about me? And when you read the book, you really understand that everyone was playing the role that culture assigned to them. We're all acting the way we've been raised to act. In some cases, it's not unconscious bias, it's pretty egregious. But I do think if we understand that this is all something about our culture, I think it makes it easier for people to take.
I want to talk about MIT because not only was it very remarkable that Nancy and the other scientists took such a scientific approach to making their case, but holy cow, MIT owned it.
Totally.
And so let's talk a little bit about how important that was and how groundbreaking that was and what that meant.
Yeah. These women had come together, suspected discrimination, and then they were like, let's investigate that. And they did what scientists do, which was to gather the information and gather the data. And they also gathered stories because there is power, huge power in stories. And those stories did make a difference particularly in bringing men along. So they gather all these statistics and they present them to the dean, and then they ultimately produce this thing called a report on the status of women faculty. The interesting thing was that this was not supposed to become public. It only became public because of my newspaper story. So, and they weren't thrilled about that, but they write this report, and then the chair of the faculty just happened to be a woman who had since the 1960s been studying the issues for women at work. She felt like this report could be a real lesson to the rest of the faculty at MIT. So she's like, why don't we publish this in the faculty newsletter? So they write it, and Nancy Hopkins happens to be speaking to the Knight Fellows in Journalism at MIT, which is a program MIT has run for years. And one of the reporters who was a fellow in that program raised his hand and said, what's it like to be a woman in science? And she said, interesting you should ask, because we've just produced this report. And the most remarkable thing is the president, who's a guy named Chuck Vest, an engineer. He wrote 2 paragraphs at the top of this report, but they were widely quoted. I've always believed that gender discrimination in contemporary higher education is part perception and part reality. True, but I now understand that reality is by far the greater part of the balance. So in other words, he was like, this is real. And so to have the president and a man and this prominent institution say it, that was huge. And the guy who leads that fellowship program, he said to her later, like, this is really incredible. Do you mind if I call people I know at the Boston Globe and the New York Times? And she was like, oh, no, don't do that. And so then she thought about it and she was like, actually, this is really remarkable that MIT is doing this. And so she called him and said, sure, if you want to spread the word, you can. So that guy phoned someone at the New York Times, phoned someone at the Boston Globe, and someone relayed this tip to me. They said, there's something going on with women and discrimination at MIT. So that's when I called Nancy and found that. I started researching the story and I said I wanted to do the story. And then this woman, the chair of the faculty, got word of this and she was like, whoa, wait, we don't want this to happen. I said, well, we're going to write the story anyway. And so then they were like, okay, really what we don't want is we don't want the faculty to read about this in the Boston Globe before they read about it from us. So we struck this deal that they would publish it in the faculty newsletter at midnight on Friday, and our story would go live at noon the next day or something like that. I guess when I say go live, I'm not even sure we were online at that point, but it was going to be in the paper. But again, MIT did not see what was coming. What was coming was, the story runs on Sunday, March 21st, 1999. The next morning, the dean of science, a guy who's been very helpful to these women, arrives in his office. There's a film crew from the CBS Evening News outside of his office. Nancy picks up her phone. It's like, Radio Australia is calling her. Like, they were just besieged with phone calls and camera crews. On Tuesday of that week, the New York Times put the story in its front page. And then suddenly they were getting emails not only from women across the country, but women around the world saying, as we've been talking about, oh my God, I thought I was the only one who felt this way. I'm so glad to hear that I'm not so alone. So at that point, yeah, MIT and Chuck Vest, the president, was like, oh, okay, now we're famous for this. We have to do something about it. So someone commented like only MIT could get credit for discriminating against women, right? But again, they did the right thing. And there was the Atlantic Philanthropies and the Ford Foundation gave them money to work with other universities to do similar kinds of investigations at other universities, particularly top universities in the United States. So yeah, I really do credit MIT with moving forward and taking credit for this.
Yeah, definitely kudos to them. I want to kind of move our conversation a little bit to what do we do about it? Because, we have all these sort of complex, emotions and opinions and behaviors and attitudes that contribute to the experience of women in any industry, right? And so one of the things that I often struggle with, how do you really put together a really clear case for what's happening to women so that you can not only articulate it to people to develop some awareness around it, but also start to move everyone to solutions, right?
Yeah. So the data, again, the tape measure, let's just use the tape measure as the, emblem of the data. The tape measure, the data was really important. But the other thing that changed minds at MIT, among the men were these stories. So just to take the first example, these 16 women come together and they write a letter to the dean of science and they say, we want to have a committee to look into, whether there are discrepancies between men and women. And they spend a long time writing this letter. They're very worried about it. They send it to him and they make an appointment to go see him. And they're convinced that like, oh my God, we use the D word. We talked about discrimination. He will have told the president. He will have called the university's lawyers. Like, we're going to be in trouble. And they go to his office and he's like, he doesn't even, it's the end of the summer. He's been away. He doesn't know why they're there. He hasn't read their letter. There's 6 of these women sitting around his conference room table. And he knows, because he's the dean of science and these are all scientists in his school, he knows each one of those women and he knows their story. And he says later, had any of those women come to me individually, I would have explained it as the exception, right? Like, I would have explained it by the circumstances, or, oh, that one has a personality conflict with this guy. That one was shut out of that project, so she didn't get the money. Maybe she should have had. But hearing them and seeing them one after another, these 6 women, they tell their story of what their career has been like at MIT. And again, just like with the data, he sees the pattern. The more we can establish patterns for people, that's really compelling. But if we also have to be kind of honest and self-reflective and maybe perform like these little mind shifts with ourselves, or like, thought experiments. Like, when you hear information from a woman, stop and ask yourself, okay, if you were a guy delivering this information, would I think about it differently? Would I take it differently? When you hear a guy saying something and you're like, oh yeah, he's right, think like, well, wait a minute. If it were Nadine telling me this, would I take it as seriously, right? Like, so I just think it sounds so basic, but I do think it's just like, we all have to kind of perform these little thought experiments with ourselves. I think, just the fact of having more numbers and having more women who you can see in these roles, and who are going to maybe have different styles of leadership, like it's going to change the culture, and therefore the biases will pass. Like, it's no longer going to be the exception when there's a woman running a large transportation system, but again, it's just, we have to change that culture. And one of the ways we do that is just sheerly through numbers.
Yeah, that's actually exactly right, I think, because I can tell you that, in my role, I regularly explore, what are the things that I'm making assumptions about.
Yeah.
So I'm so bummed because we're running out of time, but I'm wondering, what advice do you have for women who are, just starting in their careers and we hope they never experience the things that Nancy experienced, but, what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah. Sometimes I worry that the message is like, raise your hand and object to every little slight. That's not my message. But I do think the message is like, I just hear a lot of like really painful, I'm thinking of 2 women in particular when I did my book talk in Cambridge last year when the book first came out. And these 2 women got up and they talked about their enormous self-doubt. And they wanted, like, how do you deal with self-doubt? So I guess if I had to boil it down, it's like, take yourself seriously. Like, why? Ask yourself, why am I thinking that I don't have the potential to do this? Why is that? Who's telling you that? Is that you? Is that society? Like, no, believe in yourself. I mean, I think that's really, like, you belong there, right? Like, you can do this. You are enough. The first female graduate of MIT was a woman named Ellen Swallow Richards. She's really incredible. She was the first person to develop like water sanitization in this country. Really amazing. She was also founder of the American Association of University Women. She was the founder of the field of home economics, which is what women scientists did at the time. And she used to sign her letters, keep thinking. And I just love that because it's just like, stay curious, right? Like question. When something happens to you, question. Like, just think about what's happening to you. So whether it's your self-doubt or something that happens to you, what's going on here? What can I do about this?
That is awesome. I mean, I love the idea of, just take yourself seriously, because I've been struggling with, how do we share with, especially young women, how do we share with them that they're going to be fine no matter what happens? It's like, they've got to just keep going and just having courage, right?
Yep. Yeah, keep going. So for my first book, not this one, for my first book, I had a little Post-it note. My husband loves to remind me of it. And I just, on the Post-it note, and I would refer to it so often that I actually took to like highlighting over it. So it was like black and pink and pencil marked by the end. Keep going. That doesn't mean that you do what Nancy and a lot of these other women did, was like, keep going and don't pay attention to the stuff that's happening to you. You do need to pay attention to it, but you also just need to like keep remembering the thing that makes you passionate about what you do. And don't forget that, because that is really such a motivator. It was a motivator for these women. It's a motivator for me. And honestly, it's like, we just got to hang on to that.
Wonderful words of wisdom. Kate Zernike, thank you so much for taking time with us. I'm so happy to meet you, and really, it's such an honor.
It was such a pleasure, Nadine. Thank you.
That was Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Kate Zernike, author of The Exceptions, Nancy Hopkins, MIT, and the Fight for Women in Science. You're listening to Mobility in Motion. I'm your host, Nadine Lee. This episode was produced by The Glue and Sasha Woodruff, edited by Jim Gates, with music by BC Campbell. If you like this episode, be sure to subscribe and tell a friend. Episodes come out every other week and are available on your favorite podcast platform.